I'd always thought my life with Clara was something solid, like a house built on stone. 20 years together, 2 kids grown and off to college, a quiet routine of coffee in the morning and her humming while she cooked dinner. She was beautiful still, those sharp green eyes, that cascade of auburn hair she'd brush absent-mindedly while reading. I'm Mark, a mechanic by trade, hands rough from years of fixing engines, but I'd always been gentle with her. We lived in a small town, the kind where everyone knows your business but pretends they don't. I never imagined I'd be the one uncovering secrets. Started with the phone. Clara's phone, left on the kitchen counter one Tuesday evening while she showered. She'd always been private about it. Not secretive, just private. I'd never had reason to doubt her. But that night, the screen lit up with a message, and I glanced over, casual as anything. Can't wait to see you tomorrow, gorgeous. No name, just a number. My stomach twisted, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a friend, a coworker from the library where she worked part-time. Still, I couldn't unsee it. I stood there, kettle whistling on the stove, steam clouding the air, and felt the first crack in that stone foundation. When she came downstairs, wrapped in her robe, hair damp, I didn't say anything. I watched her move, graceful as always, pouring tea, smiling at me like nothing was wrong. Long day? She asked, and I nodded, grunting something about a busted transmission. She didn't mention the message, didn't check her phone. I lay awake that night, her breathing soft beside me, and wondered who gorgeous was meant for. By morning, I'd convinced myself I was overreacting, until I saw her getting ready. She wore that blue dress, the one she hadn't touched in years, and lipstick. Clara never wore lipstick for work. I kissed her goodbye, tasting the unfamiliar gloss, and watched her drive off. The shop was slow that day, engines humming in the background, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept picturing her laughing with someone else, her hand brushing a stranger's arm. I'd never been jealous. Clara wasn't the type, or so I'd thought. But doubt is a weed. It grows fast. That evening, she came home late, claiming a staff meeting. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes too bright. I asked how her day was, casual as I could manage, and she waved it off, saying, "Oh, books and boring people." I didn't push. Not yet. The next few days, I watched her like a hawk. It wasn't healthy. I knew that, but the message gnawed at me. She'd leave her phone face down now, a habit she'd never had before. I started noticing things, how she'd linger in the bathroom longer, how she'd hum a tune I didn't recognize. I wasn't sleeping well, either. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, imagining her somewhere else, with someone else. I needed proof, something concrete, before I confronted her. So I did something I'd never dreamed of. I followed her. It was a Thursday, her half-day at the library. She kissed me goodbye, same as always, and I waited 10 minutes before taking the truck. I parked a block from the library, feeling ridiculous, like some paranoid fool in a movie. She came out at noon, right on schedule, but instead of heading home, she drove toward the edge of town. My heart thudded as I trailed her, keeping my distance. She pulled into the lot of a diner I'd never liked, greasy spoons and chipped mugs. I watched her step out, that blue dress swaying, and then I saw him. He was tall, lean, with dark hair and a smile that made my fists clench. He met her at the door, hand on her back like it belonged there. They went inside, and I sat in my truck, knuckles white on the steering wheel. I wanted to storm in, demand answers, but I needed more. I waited, engine off, sweat beating on my neck despite the cool air. An hour later, they came out, laughing, her head tilted toward him. He leaned down, whispered something, and she giggled, "Clara, my Clara," giggling like a schoolgirl. They got into his car, a sleek black thing, and drove off. I followed. They didn't go far, just a motel, one of those cheap places off the highway. My chest burned as I watched them park, watched him open her door, watched her take his hand. They disappeared into a room, curtains drawn, and I sat there, numb. I didn't need to see more. I knew. The woman I'd built my life with was in there, with him, doing things I couldn't even let myself picture. I drove home, hands shaking, mind racing. Revenge wasn't a word I'd ever lingered on, but it planted itself then, deep and dark. I didn't confront her that night. She came home at 6, same flushed cheeks, same bright eyes, spinning a tale about helping a coworker with a flat tire. I nodded, cooked dinner, steak, her favorite, and watched her eat, chatting about nothing. Inside, I was a furnace, rage and hurt melting together. I needed a plan, something to make her feel what I felt, something to strip her bare the way she'd stripped me. But first, I needed to know who he was. The next day, I called in sick and dug into her life. I started with her phone, waiting until she was in the shower. She'd added a passcode, another new habit, but I'd seen her type it once, half asleep. Our anniversary? 0615. I got in, scrolled fast. The number from that first message was saved as Tom, Library. Text stretched back months. Missed you today. Your smile kills me. Room 12 again? My hands shook as I photographed the screen, evidence piling up. I checked her email next, using the laptop she never locked. There it was, an itinerary for a weekend seminar next month. But the hotel confirmation showed 2 guests. Tom, I guessed. I searched the web, cross-referencing Tom with the library. Thomas Hargrove, assistant director, popped up. Dark hair, smug grin, matching the man from the diner. He lived an hour away, married, no kids. I stared at his photo, memorizing every line of his face. Clara came downstairs, towel around her head, and I shut the laptop, smiling like nothing was wrong. You okay? She asked, and I said, just tired. She didn't push. That night, I lay awake, plotting. Revenge wasn't enough, I wanted ruin. I thought about exposing them, humiliating them, but that felt too small. I wanted something they'd carry forever, something that'd twist their insides like they'd twisted mine. I started small. I'd follow Tom, learn his life, his weaknesses. The next morning, I drove to his town, parked near the library branch he managed. He arrived at 9, whistling, carefree. I watched him all day, noting his routines, coffee at 10, lunch at 1, a call on his phone at 3, laughing. I hated him, hated his ease. By dusk, I knew where he lived, where he ate, where he parked that black car. I was building something piece by piece. Clara noticed I was quieter, but I brushed it off. Work stress, I said. She bought it or pretended to. I kept up the act, kissing her goodbye, fixing her car when it squeaked, while inside I was carving out a plan. Tom was the key. He was the one who'd stepped into my life, and he'd pay first. I spent a week tailing him, learning his world. He was careless, arrogant, leaving his car unlocked, his house unwatched. His wife, Ellen, was a thin woman with tired eyes, always home when he wasn't. I wondered if she knew, if she suspected. I'd make sure she did. I started with his car. Late one night, I drove to his place, parked a street over. He was out, probably with Clara, I thought, the idea a knife in my gut. I slipped into his driveway, popped the hood with a screwdriver, and loosened a few wires. Nothing fatal, just enough to strand him somewhere. The next day, I watched from a distance as he cursed, stranded on the highway, calling for a tow. Small, petty, but it felt good. I wasn't done. Then I turned to Ellen. I printed the photos from Clara's phone, texts, timestamps, motel receipts I'd found in her purse, and mailed them anonymously to his house, addressed to her. I added a note. He's not who you think. I didn't sign it, didn't need to. 3 days later, I saw her leave, bags packed, face red and swollen. Tom came home to an empty house, pacing the porch, phone to his ear. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Clara came home that night, distracted, saying Tom had family issues. I nodded, poured her wine, and said nothing. But it wasn't enough. I wanted Clara to hurt, to feel the betrayal I'd felt. I started digging into her past, her secrets. She'd always been vague about her college years, brushing off questions with a laugh. I found an old box in the attic, letters, photos, a name, Daniel. A boyfriend, I guessed, from before me. I tracked him down online, divorced, living 2 states over. I wrote him, pretending to be Clara, hinting at rekindling things. He replied fast, eager. I set up a meeting, knowing she'd never show. Step 1. Clara's routine didn't change, but I could tell something was off. She'd check her phone more, frown at messages, sigh when she thought I wasn't looking. Tom must have been unraveling, his life cracking under Ellen's exit. Good. I kept the pressure on him, slashing a tire one night, leaving a crack in his windshield the next. Anonymous, untraceable. He'd look over his shoulder now. I knew it. But Clara, she was still playing her part, still lying to my face. I needed her to break, too. Daniel was my next move. I'd set up the meeting for a Friday, a cafe halfway between us. I used her old email, one she'd forgotten about but I'd found in the attic box, mimicking her tone. "I've missed you, Dan. Let's catch up." He'd written back, all nostalgia and hope, agreeing to meet. I drove there myself, 2 hours, and watched from across the street as he sat, waiting, checking his watch. He stayed an hour, then left, shoulders slumped. I mailed him a follow-up from Clara. An apology, a promise to reschedule, keeping him on the hook. I wanted her past to haunt her, to confuse her when it surfaced. Back home, I planted seeds. I left the attic box open one day, letters scattered, and waited. She found it that evening, rushing upstairs, face pale. "Mark, did you go through this?" she asked, voice tight. I shrugged, said I was cleaning, and watched her shove it back, hands trembling. She didn't know I'd contacted Daniel, didn't know I was weaving her old life into this mess. That night, she barely spoke, lost in her thoughts. I cooked dinner, acted normal, but I could feel her slipping. Then Tom called her. I saw his name flash on her screen while she slept. I answered, silent, and heard him whisper, "Clara, I need you. Ellen's gone." I hung up, deleted the call log, and smiled. The next day, she was restless, making excuses to leave. I let her go, followed her to the motel. Tom was there, frantic, and she held him, soothing him. I took photos, more evidence, more fuel. My revenge was growing, sharp and cold, and I wasn't done yet. Clara came home that night from the motel, her excuses thinner than ever. She mumbled something about a friend in crisis, her eyes avoiding mine as she slipped into the kitchen to make tea. I nodded, pretending to buy it, while the photos I'd taken burned a hole in my phone. Her with Tom, arms around him, his face buried in her shoulder. It was a scene I couldn't unsee. I poured myself a whiskey, the first in years, and let the burn steady me. She didn't notice how quiet I was, how my hands gripped the glass. She was too wrapped up in her own unraveling world. I kept up the pressure on Tom. His life was already fracturing. Ellen gone, his car a mess, but I wasn't satisfied. I dug deeper, found his social media, his habits. He liked to fish, posted photos of quiet lakes and big catches. I drove to his favorite spot the next weekend, a place an hour out of town, while Clara thought I was at the shop. His gear was there, unattended by the shore. I slashed his cooler, scattered his bait, and left a note pinned to his tackle box. "You don't deserve peace," and signed, of course. I imagined his confusion, his anger, and it fueled me. Back home, I turned to Clara's weak spots. She'd always cared about what people thought, her reputation, her perfect little life. I started small, subtle. I mentioned to our neighbor, Mrs. Grady, how Clara had been out a lot lately helping a friend. Mrs. Grady's a gossip. I knew it had spread. Soon, I caught whispers at the grocery store, saw sidelong glances at church. Clara didn't notice yet, but she would. I wanted her to feel eyes on her, questions she couldn't answer. I wanted her to squirm. Then Daniel called. I'd left her old phone, a relic from the attic, plugged in, synced to that forgotten email. She'd never noticed me slipping it into the guest room. The screen lit up while she was downstairs, and I answered, voice low. "Clara?" he said, hesitant. I stayed silent, let him ramble about the cafe, how he'd waited. "I just want to see you," he finished. I hung up, deleted the call, and smiled. He'd keep reaching out, I'd make sure of it. Her past was a ghost I'd summoned to haunt her. The cracks in Clara's facade were widening. She snapped at me over breakfast one morning. Burnt toast, of all things, her patience fraying. I stayed calm, watched her storm off to work. I knew she wasn't going to the library. Tom's texts had begged her to meet him again. I followed, saw them at a park this time, sitting on a bench, his hand on her knee. She looked tired, conflicted, but she didn't pull away. I took more photos, my collection growing, a silent weapon I'd wield when the time was right. Tom's life was a mess now. I'd called his library branch, anonymous, claiming he'd been rude to patrons. A small lie, but it stuck. He got a warning I heard through a friend who worked there. I kept up the sabotage, too, keyed his car one night, left fish guts on his porch the next. Petty, maybe, but each jab was a brick in the wall I was building around him. He'd started drinking more. I noticed, his eyes bloodshot when I spied him leaving a bar. Good. Let him drown. Clara came home late again, claiming a book club ran long. I asked who was there, casual, and she stumbled, naming people I knew didn't read. I let it slide, poured her wine, and watched her sip it, nervous. That night, I left the guest room, phone on the counter. Daniel's latest email open. Clara? Why won't you answer? I need to know if it's real. She found it the next morning, froze, and turned to me, voice shaking. Mark, what's this? I shrugged, said I'd found it cleaning, asked if she knew a Daniel. Her face went white, and she muttered something about an old friend before rushing upstairs. I'd rattled her. The whispers were spreading, too. Mrs. Grady cornered me at the mailbox, asking if Clara was okay, saying folks had seen her around with a man who wasn't me. I played dumb, thanked her for her concern. Clara hadn't noticed the stairs yet, but she would soon. I wanted her to feel exposed, trapped in a web she didn't even see yet. My revenge was a slow burn, and I was just getting started. Clara was unraveling faster now. She'd check her phone obsessively, jump at every noise. Tom must have been leaning on her hard, his life a wreck thanks to me. I kept the guest room phone alive, feeding Daniel's hope with vague replies from Clara. I'm confused. Give me time. He'd email back, desperate, and I'd let her find them, watch her panic. She asked me once, voice tight, if I'd been in her old things again. I said no, calm as anything, and she dropped it, but I saw the doubt in her eyes. She was starting to suspect something. I upped the ante with Tom. I found his wife, Ellen, online, new address, new life. I sent her more photos, ones I'd taken at the park, with a note. He's still at it. Thought you should know. She wouldn't confront him, I figured, but she'd spread it. Friends, family, his reputation. Sure enough, a week later, Tom's car was gone from his house, replaced by a for sale sign. Word was he'd lost his job. 2. Rumors of personal issues. I smiled every time I drove by that empty lot. Clara felt it, too. She came home one night, shaken, saying someone at work had asked if she was seeing someone. The gossip had reached the library. She laughed it off, but her eyes darted to me, searching. I shrugged, said small towns talk, and watched her squirm. That night, she barely touched dinner, lost in thought. I left another Daniel email open. I'll come to you if you won't meet me. And she found it, hands trembling as she deleted it. She didn't ask me about it this time. She was scared. I started phase 2, her family. Clara's sister, Beth, lived 3 hours away, always nosy about our lives. I called her, casual, mentioned Clara seemed distant. Asked if she'd heard from any old flames. Beth latched on, promising to check in. 2 days later, Clara's phone rang. Beth, loud and worried. I heard Clara stammer, deny, hang up red-faced. The net was tightening, and she didn't even know I was the one pulling the strings. Clara stopped sleeping well. She'd toss and turn, muttering in her dreams, waking with dark circles under her eyes. I played the concerned husband, made her tea, asked if she was okay, but inside I was cold, calculating. Tom was a ghost now, gone from town, his house sold to strangers. I'd driven him out, but Clara didn't know how deep my hand went. She'd call him sometimes, late, whispering in the bathroom, thinking I couldn't hear. I did, every word. I can't keep doing this, Tom. It's too much. Too late, I thought. Daniel showed up a week later. I'd sent him one last email. Meet me at home. I'm ready. With our address. I timed it for a Saturday, when Clara was home alone. I watched from the shop, camera ready, as he knocked on our door. She answered, confused, then horrified as he explained he'd been talking to her. I snapped photos, her gesturing wildly, him pleading, before he left, defeated. She called me after, voice shaking, saying some crazy ex had shown up. I acted surprised, promised to come home, and let her stew. The town was buzzing now. Mrs. Grady told me she'd seen a strange man at our place. Asked if Clara had company. I sighed, said I'd handle it, knowing she'd tell everyone. Clara's co-workers whispered. Her sister called again, demanding answers. She started avoiding people, staying home, her perfect image crumbling. I kept the pressure on, left old photos of her and Daniel on the counter, accidentally spilled wine on her blue dress. She was breaking, and I was the quiet storm behind it. I mailed Tom one last thing. A photo of Clara and Daniel at our door with a note. She's moved on. So should you. I didn't care if he believed it. I wanted him to doubt her, to feel abandoned. He'd call her, I knew, and she'd deny it, and they'd fracture more. My revenge was a symphony now, every note hitting harder, and Clara was center stage, oblivious to the conductor. Clara was a shadow of herself by then. She'd stopped wearing that blue dress, stopped humming, stopped smiling at me like she used to. The town talked openly now, her mystery man at the house, her late nights, her troubled marriage. She'd snap at me over nothing, then apologize, eyes wet. I stayed steady, calm, feeding her guilt. You seem stressed, I'd say, and she'd nod, muttering about work, lies piling up. I knew she'd called Tom again. He'd left a voicemail I deleted, his voice slurred, begging her to run away with him. She wouldn't, I'd made sure of that. Daniel kept emailing, confused, hurt. I replied once more, I can't do this, leave me alone, and let her find it. She confronted me, wild-eyed, asking if I'd seen her old phone. I said no, suggested she'd left it somewhere, watched her spiral. Beth came to visit unannounced, cornering Clara about old boyfriends and rumors. I played dumb, made coffee, let Beth dig. Clara sent her away, furious, and turned to me, pleading. Mark, what's happening? I shrugged, said life's messy, and left her to drown in it. Tom's car showed up one night, parked down the street. I saw him through the window, pacing, drunk. I slipped out, silent, and smashed his taillights with a wrench, left a note under his wiper. She's done with you. He drove off, swerving, and I knew he'd crash somewhere, his problem now. Clara didn't hear a thing, asleep with pills she'd started taking. I burned the photos I'd taken, evidence gone, my hands clean. The final piece was her job. I called the library. Anonymous. Said I'd seen her with a man during work hours, hinted at misconduct. They investigated, found her late arrivals, her excuses. She got a warning, then quit, humiliated. She came home sobbing, saying she couldn't take the stairs. I held her, whispered it'd be okay, and felt nothing. Her life, our life, was ash, and I'd lit the match. Clara barely left the house anymore. She'd sit by the window, staring at nothing, her auburn hair tangled, her green eyes dull. The pills were her crutch now. Sleeping aids, anxiety meds, whatever the doctor scribbled after she'd cried about stress. I kept the kitchen stocked, played the dutiful husband, but my heart was stone. She'd murmur apologies sometimes, vague things like, I've messed up, Mark. And I'd nod, say we'd get through it, knowing we wouldn't. Her world was shrinking, and I was the architect. Tom was a wreck, too. I'd heard through a buddy who'd seen him, living in a cheap apartment an hour away, drinking himself into a stupor. His car had crashed that night. I'd smashed his lights, landed him a DUI, and his license was gone. I'd mailed him that last photo of Clara and Daniel, and it had worked. He'd stopped calling her, convinced she'd betrayed him, too. I smiled every time I thought of him alone, clutching a bottle, wondering where it all went wrong. He'd never know it was me. The town kept talking. Mrs. Grady stopped by with a casserole, fishing for details, saying folks felt sorry for me, the loyal husband. I thanked her, let the pity spread. Clara overheard once, snapped at me to make them stop. But I shrugged, said I couldn't control rumors. She'd glare, then retreat, defeated. I'd planted more seeds. Mentioned to the pastor how Clara seemed lost. Asked for prayers. Soon, church ladies were calling, offering support, their voices dripping with judgment. Clara stopped answering the phone. I brought Daniel back one last time. I'd kept his emails going, stringing him along with Clara's regrets, her confusion. I sent a final message. Meet me at the park. I need closure. And watched from my truck as he showed up, hopeful, clutching a rose. Clara wasn't there, of course, but I tipped off Beth, who'd happened to drive by. She saw him, called Clara, furious, demanding to know why that man was still around. Clara denied it, sobbing, and Beth hung up, done with her. I came home to Clara curled on the couch, broken, and offered her tea, my face a mask. Clara's sister cutting her off was the tipping point. Beth had been her anchor, her confidant, and now she was gone, convinced Clara was a liar. I listened as Clara left voicemails, pleading, her voice cracking. Beth, please, it's not what you think. No reply came. I'd made sure of that, slipping Beth a letter from Clara, confessing to old habits and mistakes. Forged, of course, but Beth bought it. Clara was alone now, no family, no friends, just me. The man she'd betrayed, the man she didn't suspect. I turned to her things next. She'd kept that blue dress in the closet, a ghost of her affair. I took it one night, shredded it with a box cutter, and left it on the bed. She found it the next morning, screamed, asked if I'd done it. I said no, suggested mice, watched her doubt herself. Her jewelry went next. Cheap trinkets Tom had given her, I'd found in her purse. I melted them over a fire in the yard, told her I was burning trash. She smelled the smoke, asked what it was, and I shrugged. Her treasures were ash. The library called once, offering her job back, but I answered, said she wasn't well, declined for her. She never knew, just assumed they'd given up on her. Her world was a cage now, home, pills, me. I'd whisper things at night, soft enough she'd half hear. You brought this on yourself. She'd stir, mumble, never sure if it was real. I wanted her mind to fray, her guilt to eat her alive. She'd stopped fighting the rumors, stopped explaining. She was a shell and I wasn't done. Tom got one last blow. I found his new address, sent a package, photos of Clara's shredded dress. A note. She's destroyed everything, hasn't she? Let him think she'd lost it. Turned on him. I pictured him opening it, hands shaking, bottle slipping. He'd have no one now, no Clara, no hope. My revenge was a double-edged blade, and they both bled. Clara started writing letters, to Beth, to Tom, to herself. I'd find them crumpled in the trash. Half-finished pleas for forgiveness, explanations that trailed off. She didn't send them, couldn't. I read them when she slept, her handwriting shaky, her words a mess of regret and confusion. I don't know how it happened, she wrote once, and I almost laughed. I knew. I'd made sure she'd never understand the full scope, never see my hand in it. She thought it was fate, karma, anything but me. I staged the next move carefully. I left the house one morning, told her I'd be at the shop late, but I doubled back, parked down the street. I'd planted a letter from Tom in the mailbox. Forged, desperate, begging her to meet him. I can't live without you, it said, with a time and place. The old motel, dusk. She found it, hesitated, then got in her car. I followed, watched her pull into the empty lot. Wait. No, Tom, of course, he didn't send it. She sat there an hour, crying, before driving home. I slipped in later, asked how her day was, and she said, fine. Voice hollow. The town's pity turned to scorn. I'd let slip at the bar. Casual, drunk sounding. How Clara had strange men around. How I tried to help her. Word spread fast. People stopped waving, started staring. Kids egged our house one night, and Clara cleaned it up silent, ashamed. I said it was just pranks, but she knew better. She'd lost everything: job, family, respect. And I'd orchestrated it all, piece by piece, without her suspecting. I called Daniel one last time, used a burner phone, mimicked Tom's voice, slurred, broken. "She's with me now, back off," I growled, then hung up. He'd think Clara had chosen Tom, close that chapter. I burned the phone after, no trace. Clara's past, her present, her future. I torched it all, left her with nothing but echoes. Clara stopped eating much. She'd push food around her plate, eyes vacant, muttering about fixing things. I cook her favorites: steak, pie, watch her try, fail. She was thin now, fragile, a ghost in our house. I kept up the act, asked if she needed a doctor, but she'd shake her head, say she was fine. She wasn't. I'd broken her spirit, and it showed in every trembling step, every sigh. I felt no pity, only a cold satisfaction. Tom's end came quietly. I'd heard he'd been evicted, moved to a shelter, his drinking too much even for that. I sent one last package: Clara's old letters from the attic, ones she'd written to me years ago, love notes I'd cherished. I added a forged one: "Tom, you were a mistake. I'm done." Let him read her words, think she'd turned on him one final time. I didn't check if it reached him. I didn't need to. He was finished, a shadow of a man, and I'd pushed him there. Clara found the guest room phone again. I'd left it out, Daniel's emails still open. She stared at it, whispered, "Who's doing this?" I walked in, acted surprised, said maybe she'd been hacked. She didn't buy it, but she didn't accuse me. She couldn't. Her mind was too muddled, her trust in herself gone. I took the phone, smashed it in the garage, told her it was junk. She nodded, blank, and shuffled away. Her reality was unraveling, and I was the thread puller. The final touch was public. I invited the pastor over, said Clara needed guidance. He came, prayed with her, asked about her struggles. She broke down, confessed to mistakes. Didn't name Tom, but didn't have to. The town already knew. Word spread. Clara was a fallen woman, and I was the saint who'd stayed. She heard the whispers at the door, saw the looks, and shrank further. I turned her life into a stage, and she was the tragic lead, alone in the spotlight. Clara left one morning. I woke to an empty bed, a note on the counter: "Mark, I can't stay. I'm sorry." No explanation, no destination, just gone. Her car was missing, her closet half empty. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. She'd run from the wreckage I'd made, from the guilt, the shame, the life I'd dismantled. I poured coffee, sat at the table, and felt the quiet settle. It was over. She'd lived somewhere, broken, looking over her shoulder, wondering how it all fell apart. I'd won. Tom, I learned later, had vanished too, left the shelter, no trace. Some said he'd drunk himself into oblivion, others that he'd moved far away, a shell of himself. I didn't care which, he was out of my story, a footnote in my revenge. The photos, the letters, the evidence. I'd burned it all, left no proof. The town pitied me still, brought me meals, called me strong. I nodded, thanked them, and let them believe what they wanted. The house stayed mine. I fixed engines, drank whiskey, lived alone. Clara's humming, her laughter, her touch, gone, erased by her betrayal and my hand. I thought once of forgiving her years ago, when that first message lit up her phone. But forgiveness wasn't me, not anymore. I'd built a ruin instead, a monument to her lies, and it stood tall. If she ever came back, she'd find nothing. Empty rooms, a cold man, a life she'd lost. Years later, someone mailed me a clipping: Clara, in a small-town paper, a blurry photo. She worked at a diner, looked older, thinner, alone. I stared at it, felt nothing, and tossed it in the fire. She'd betrayed me, and I'd repaid her, cruelty for cruelty. Tom was gone, she was a ghost, and I was free. Revenge wasn't loud or messy. It was patient, precise, and mine was complete.